What's up YouTube? It's GhostRider15 here, back at it again with another GOAT format video. So I made a tier list earlier on in the year for GOAT format, and now that it's the end of the year, I think it's time to make another one. So yeah, without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting off with Panda Burn. Um, so Panda Burn is a very strong deck. It's very degenerate. It has so many different ways that it can just steal games. It doesn't rely on card advantage. So yeah, this deck can just win with burn cards, and even if it doesn't rely on card advantage, it can still get the card advantage back with cards like Morphing Jar and Cyber Jar. And in this deck, once those cards resolve, like the duel's basically over 95% of the time. So yeah, I think Panda Burn is a tier 1 deck. Next up is Monarchs. I think Monarchs are decent. They're not amazing because they are a tribute summon mechanic, and just because of the way the game works, you have to tribute something, and it's more likely for that you'll end up bricking with this type of strategy. But if you do pull it off, it's really strong because cards like Mobius, Zaborg, even Testalos, they're all really good. They have strong effects. And you do have cards like Soul Exchange to be able to mitigate that problem with the tribute mechanic. And yeah, being able to tribute your opponent's monsters is really good because it's really hard to get rid of set monsters besides Noblemen of Crossout. So Soul Exchange is another way to do it. I think this deck is pretty decent. It's like tier 2. Next up, we have PacMan. PacMan is a deck that I've been using sometimes for fun. Yeah, it's a really fun deck in my opinion. I know most players hate it, and I don't know why. I mean, the deck is not really good. It is not good. Sure, you can try to stall it out, and you can try to plus with cards like Des Lakuta. You can try to draw more cards every turn by reusing the flip effect. Well, it's not technically a flip effect, but it's like a pseudo flip effect that doesn't resolve if you attack into Des Lakuta. So yeah, that is the downside. If they attack into it, you don't get the effect because it's not a flip effect. So yeah, I think this deck is tier 3. Next up is Last Turn. I think Last Turn is the worst possible alt-win deck you can play in GOAT format. It's not good. Yeah, with all the Solemn Judgments going around, it's less likely for you to resolve this card. And yeah, I haven't seen anyone actually top with this, so it hasn't been doing anything at all. I think this is tier 3. Next up is Warriors. So, I think Warriors is extremely broken. It's, in my opinion, the most resilient deck of the format. Also, it really helps that nobody is pre-siding for you if you're playing Warrior. If you're a Warrior player, you love that. Nobody's maining Sakuretsus. Nobody's maining Widespread Ruins. Nobody's maining Swords of Revealing Light. So nobody pre-sides for Warrior. And everybody's pre-siding cards like Mind Control, Triple Trap Dust Shoe. And as a Warrior player, you love to see that. Players are basically giving away free wins game 1 to Warrior players. So yeah, I'm actually going to make a video on that later in the future, discussing more in depth about that. But yeah, as for now, Warriors are definitely tier 1. So next up I have the Cyberstein OTK deck. So this deck, if it goes off, it is amazing because what are you going to do? Nobody main decks Karibo, so you can't really do much about it. If they have the nuts, if they have True Nade, Cyberstein, and they have Megamorph, there's really nothing you can do, at least game 1. But if you put this deck below 5,000 life points, they really can't win. They don't really have that many ways to win. because they don't play like the traditional Reasoning Gate deck. They don't play Dimension Fusion, so they don't have that as a backup option. So they struggle a lot more to win once Cyberstein is off the table. And yeah, if this deck bricks, it bricks really hard. It really can't do much. So I think it's still a decent deck. It's not tier 1, but it is tier 2. Next up, we have Gearfried. So the Gearfried version of Warrior, in my opinion, is a weaker version of the actual tier 1 Warrior deck. Because Gearfried, although it has really great stats, it's immune to Snatch Steal, it's not as good as cards like Blade Knight. So yeah, I think if you're playing cards like Smoke Grenade, you're playing cards like Blast with Chain, they are really strong if you are able to resolve them. But if you don't have Gearfried, then those cards are just bricks. And yeah, you're just adding more bricks to your Warrior deck by playing this engine. So it is a very high risk, high reward type of thing that usually doesn't end up working out. I haven't seen this deck top in a very long time, so yeah, I have it as tier 2 because it's not terrible, it's just not good. Next up is the Zoo Beatdown deck. I remember this deck being really popular back in like 2020. I was seeing some play. But yeah, I think now this deck is severely outdated. This is basically an outdated version of Warriors. It's just not good enough. I haven't seen it do anything. I mean, you can probably like win a few games here and there. Maybe top a small tournament, but I don't see this deck ever like really winning anything. So, I'll put it like at the bottom of tier 2. I'll be a little generous on that. Next up is the Water Dataless deck. I've seen this deck sometimes being played on Dueling Book Ladder, and it is terrible. It is really, really bad. You're relying on a monster that's requires 2 tributes. I know it's only 1 if you have the Legendary Ocean, but if you don't, it is extremely awful. The effect is decent, don't get me wrong, but more than likely, it's gonna be a brick. So yeah, this deck is just really bad. Don't play this deck. Next up is the Chaos Flipflop deck. Basically, Chaos with a bunch of flip monsters where you have multiple Tsukiyomis. You keep trying to recycle cards like Mask Restrict so you can lock your opponent out of plane with cards like Wind Blast. This deck is decent. I like it. I've played it before. It's a little weaker than your regular Chaos Turbo because you're more vulnerable to decks like Warriors, which is extremely popular right now. Cards like Blade Knight, Mystic Swordsman level 2, even Mind Control. You're more vulnerable to Mind Control as well, because this deck focuses way more on the flip aspect of it. So yeah, I think this is more like a tier 2 deck. Next up is Chaos Control. Chaos Control is in a weird spot. It hasn't really won or topped much lately this year, compared to something like 2 years ago or a year ago even. I think that the deck is still pretty strong. You just have to play it different now. Like back then, you were playing like a bunch of traps in it. But nowadays, I think the correct way to play Chaos Control decks, or any like Scapegoat deck in general, is you have to play Royal Decree, in my opinion. Like, I hate Royal Decree, but it's just the way you have to play the deck now, because you really need to be able to shut down the trap cards that Warrior players play, that Burn players play, and that Turbo players play, so you can be able to freely summon Thousand Eyes without worrying. So yeah, I think this deck is still very strong. You just have to play it different. I think it's at the top of tier 2. Next up is Empty Jar. Empty Jar hasn't done a single thing in years. I think the last time this deck actually topped was like 2020 Worlds. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's correct. And yeah, this deck is in the worst spot it can possibly be right now. Trap Dust Shoot has been played in multiple copies. So is Solemn Judgment. And those two cards are very, very bad for Empty Jar players to see. Those cards just destroy this deck. I don't think this deck is gonna do anything anytime soon. So it's tier 3. Next up is Gravekeepers. Gravekeepers, I don't think they're that good in GOAT format. Especially now that everyone plays Gravekeeper Spies. Even Warrior players are playing it now these days. So something like Necro Valley is not even that good anymore. Your opponent, if you're playing Gravekeepers, now you have to worry about your opponent being able to wall you with their own spies, because sure, your monsters get a boost, but so do your opponent's spies as well, so you still can't do much. So yeah, I think this deck is like a tier 3 deck. Next up is Chaos Turbo, the deck that I like to play the most. Right now, Chaos Turbo is in a really weird spot because sure, there are a lot of players that are still doing well with it, but there's also a lot of players that are pre-siding really hard for Turbo, and they just worry about the Turbo matchup. They just disregard decks like Warrior. So Turbo is actually gonna struggle a bit more with main deck Dust Shoots, main deck Mind Controls, main deck Kaikus. Like stuff like that is actually gonna hurt the deck a bit. With that being said, the deck is still very, very resilient. Probably the most resilient deck in the format in my opinion. Because although there's still a lot of pre-siders, this deck is still doing great. So yeah, I think if something like the opposite were to be true, like if there is a lot of pre-side for Warriors, I don't think Warriors would be as resilient as Turbo. So I do think the best deck still is Turbo. Next up is the Return from a Different Dimension deck. So this deck is I think it's really strong. It won Worlds 2 years ago, and or a year ago. And if you activate cards like Return from a Different Dimension, you're just able to steal games if you're able to play through Torrential or Mirror Force. If you're able to bait out those cards, this deck is very strong. And yeah, not many players prepare for it. Like, you don't really expect it, but when it does end up resolving, you just win the game sometimes. And I think it's very strong. I think it's like somewhere in the high tier 2. Next up is the deck that everyone hates, and for a good reason, Library FTK. I'm so glad that this deck still isn't allowed in most online tournaments, because the deck is very, very dumb, very ignorant when it actually works. When it works, your opponent isn't able to do anything. There's no hand traps in GOAT format, so you can't stop this. If it goes off and it wins, you're not gonna get a turn. You're not gonna do anything. But with that being said, if it does brick, the game's pretty much over. Like, you just win. You're able to just kill them. And also, Solemn Judgment and Trap Dust Shoot are really good cards against this deck, which is being played everywhere right now. So yeah, this deck, although I don't think it's the best alt win deck, I don't think it's the worst either. So I think it's like a tier 2 deck. Alright, so next up is Reasoning Gate. I think Reasoning Gate is decent. It's not amazing, but it's not bad. There are times where you can just go Dimension Fusion, Demock, Dimension Fusion again, and the game's pretty much over, you know? Like, you just FTK or not, or sometimes FTK, sometimes you can OTK as well. The deck is just broken, and there are going to be times where you also can't do much. Like, a single well-timed Solemn Judgment can make this deck brick really bad. And also, if you put them below 2,000 life points, they're very limited on how they can beat you now. This deck did top a couple of events this year. Not a lot, but it did. So I do have to put it in tier 2. Next up is Recruiter Chaos. So this is basically Chaos with a lot of Recruiter monsters such as Shining Angel and Mystic Tomato instead of Flip monsters. So I think this deck, the main problem with this deck is that you rely more on your opponent doing something against you in order for you to be able to gain advantage. What I mean by that is, for example, if you're playing the standard Chaos Turbo deck, and if you set it to Koichi, you don't have to worry about what your opponent's gonna do really. You can just flip your own Koichi on your own turn and get your +1. Whereas something like Shining Angel relies on your opponent attacking into it, or else it's not gonna do anything. The main problem also is that it's very hard to gain advantage with this deck if you're not drawing into cards like Creature Swap. And also, the good thing about it is that it doesn't lose to Mind Control. That is very good. I like that it doesn't lose to Mind Control. But with that being said, I still don't think it's a really strong deck because it doesn't gain advantage as fast as your standard Chaos Turbo deck. So I put this in like tier 2. Next up is standard Go Control, the deck that was considered the best deck of the format back in 2005. Nowadays, that isn't true, but still, with that being said, it's still not a bad deck. It just evolved similar to Chaos Control. You just have to play it differently now. You can't play it back like how it was back in 2005. Yeah, you just have to play more cards like Royal Decree. As much as I hate that card, it's very good in this type of strategy, in my opinion. So yeah, I think it's somewhere in like the top of tier 2. So next up is Rescue Cat. I think this deck is absolutely insane. This deck is amazing. If you go Rescue Cat, Giant Trunade, Last Will, like, what are they gonna do? Nobody main decks Karibo. Nobody main decks Threatening Roar. Nobody main decks like all these really niche answers. So yeah, game 1, if you're able to resolve that, you basically win. And if this deck can't finish you off by damage, it certainly will with burn cards. So this deck has a backup option just in case, and it's insane. Like, it's super insane. A lot of people think that I was being too harsh when I made that video on hitting all the cat burn cards, but I don't think I was. Like, I think this deck is insane, and I'm glad a lot of players don't play this deck because in my opinion it is tier 1 and probably one of the best decks of the format. Maybe the 3rd best, right behind Warriors and Turbo. So yeah. Next up is Zombies. Zombies are decent. They have a really good warrior matchup, so they have that going for them. But the problem with zombies is they lose really hard to themselves by drawing multiple copies of Ryukoki or Vampire Lord. Also, they lose very hard to cards like Phoenix Wind Blast. Wind Blast is this deck's worst nightmare because you put cards like Vampire Lord and Ryukoki to the top and they're gonna break really hard. So yeah, I still think this deck is decent, but it's not amazing. I don't think it'll ever be tier 1, but somewhere in tier 2 is fine in my opinion. And the last deck I have on the list is the Machine OTK type of deck that uses cards like Dimension Fusion, it uses Limiter Removal, X-Head Cannon. Yeah, this deck isn't good. It's more like a meme in my opinion. It hasn't really topped anything as far as I'm concerned. I've seen players try to use it on Building Book Ladder, and most of them don't end up doing so hot. So yeah, I think this deck is really bad. It's definitely tier 3. So yeah, that's basically my tier list for Go format. If you like this type of content, please like and subscribe. This is Ghostwriter15 signing out.